She was just the nanny, until the CEO's will changed everything. May this story be a mirror to the soul, a lesson for the heart, and a comfort for those navigating love, loss, and legacy. May every listener find strength in truth, healing in understanding, and hope in the possibility of second chances. Amen. Welcome to Mr. Asher's Stories, where the quietest lives often hold the loudest truths. This is your haven for real-life lessons, wrapped in unforgettable tales. Before we begin, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us continue telling stories that matter, stories that stir the heart and speak to the soul. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter of truth, love, and redemption. The Whitaker mansion had always been quiet in the mornings, even more so in autumn. The grand estate, built from stone and legacy, sat just outside Manhattan like a fortress of wealth and secrets. The soft hum of the central heating system filled the air like a whisper of old money. But Grace Miller heard something else. Not voices, not footsteps, just absence. And that absence wrapped itself around her like a shroud. The last time she'd heard Robert Whitaker's voice had been 2 weeks ago. "Take care of them, Grace," he had said. "All of them. They'll need you." She had nodded, quietly as always, not questioning what he meant. It hadn't occurred to her that the next time she'd walk into his study, it would be as the executor of his will. But this wasn't where Grace's story began. Her story started decades earlier, before the polished mahogany floors, before the silent dining room filled with disappointment, before her name would ever be spoken alongside words like inheritance and power. It began as a job, as a duty, and it became her life. The Whitaker brownstone in Manhattan was pristine and cold, like something out of an architectural digest spread. Grace had only been 24 when she first walked through its doors, resume in hand, heart pounding. She wasn't wearing designer shoes. Her coat had a missing button, and she'd barely made it on time because the subway broke down, but she walked in anyway. It was Robert Whitaker himself who opened the door. She hadn't expected that. He was taller in person, thinner, his tie was crooked, his eyes dark-circled with exhaustion, and the 2 children clinging behind him, David, then 12, and Elizabeth, barely 9, looked like they hadn't smiled in weeks. Robert had cleared his throat. "You're Grace Miller." "Yes, sir," she'd said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Come in," he'd nodded. No smiles, no welcoming words. Just a glance toward the staircase where Elizabeth had already disappeared. David stayed behind, arms crossed. "She doesn't talk to anyone," Robert had muttered, referring to his daughter. "David's angry. You'll be taking care of them, if they let you." And just like that, her role had begun, not as a nanny, not at first, but as a stand-in for the warmth this house had lost. Robert's wife had died in a car crash less than 4 months prior. Everyone whispered about how quickly the accident came, how it had derailed his life. But no one talked about what it did to the children. They were too busy focusing on Robert's return to work, on Whitaker Industries' rising stock, on how the man seemed to be grieving by burying himself in meetings. Grace had been hired because someone needed to care, and she did. Oh, how she did. In those early years, Grace worked 14-hour days. She cooked, she listened, she consoled without saying too much. She taught Elizabeth how to braid her hair, helped David with his math homework, and stood quietly at the back of the room during parent-teacher conferences when Robert couldn't attend. When Elizabeth cried at night, it was Grace who rocked her. When David lashed out, it was Grace who spoke gently and waited until his rage broke into tears. And when Robert would come home past midnight, smelling faintly of cigars and the pressure of empire, it was Grace who handed him updates, small notes scribbled with what the kids had eaten, what they'd said, what they'd needed. Sometimes he would pause and look at her like he wanted to say something more. But he never did. Theirs was a silent understanding. He trusted her, and she never betrayed that trust. Not once. Time passed. The house filled with new rhythms. David went to college. Elizabeth moved to the West Coast to curate art. Robert remarried. Victoria came into the house like a storm with pearls. She was beautiful, social, sophisticated, and she never liked Grace. Not outright, not with words, but with coldness, with distance, with the way she always introduced Grace as the help, even though Emily, her own daughter, would run to Grace before she ever ran to Victoria. When baby Emily got pneumonia, it was Grace who nursed her through the night. When Robert returned from a trip and found his youngest daughter asleep in Grace's arms, he'd said something she never forgot: "I don't know what we'd do without you." Grace had smiled, modest as always, and replied, "You won't have to find out." And yet, here she was, without Robert, without a job, without a home, standing outside a lawyer's office, summoned for the reading of a will she never knew included her. Thomas Abernathy was a kind man, older, soft-spoken, with eyes that had seen too much of families torn apart by money. He had been Robert's lawyer for over 30 years, and his voice didn't waver as he read the legal document that changed everything. "I hereby appoint Grace Miller as executor of my estate." David had stiffened. Victoria had gasped. Elizabeth had reached for Grace's hand instinctively. And Emily, sweet 12-year-old Emily, had looked confused. "What does that mean?" she'd whispered, tugging her mother's sleeve. "It means," Victoria said with venom barely concealed, "that your father lost his mind." Grace had said nothing. She couldn't speak. Her voice was trapped in her throat like guilt, because this wasn't just a promotion. It was a betrayal, not by her, but through her. Grace packed her things quietly. Victoria had told her to leave. "You are no longer welcome in this house," she'd said, standing at the top of the stairs like a queen casting out a traitor. Grace had nodded. She didn't argue. She never had. She folded the photo Emily had drawn for her last week and placed it inside her purse. She touched the side of her bed, her room, the life she'd built inside these walls. And then she left. No grand goodbye, just the silent closing of a door she had opened every morning for 20 years. Martha Alvarez had been the housekeeper, but more importantly, she was Grace's friend. She opened the door to her tiny cottage that night, with arms already outstretched. "Come in, Hermana," she said gently. Grace fell into her arms and wept. Not because she'd lost her job, not even because the family she loved now hated her, but because for the first time in her life, someone had handed her power, and she didn't know how to hold it without hurting someone. David sat in his penthouse, glass of scotch in hand, eyes glued to the TV. "CEO leaves company in hands of Nanny," the headline blared across the bottom of the screen. He scoffed. "Unbelievable." His phone buzzed. It was a board member from Whitaker Industries. "David," the voice said, "what the hell is going on?" Back at the mansion, Victoria was screaming at the estate lawyer over the phone. She was just the nanny. She hissed. How could he do this? Thomas remained calm. Robert trusted her judgment. "And you're still provided for an allowance?" She spat. "I was his wife." "His executor has discretion," Thomas said softly. And he made that discretion very clear. Victoria nearly crushed the phone in her hand. Grace's name wasn't just on the documents. It was everywhere. In the foundation, in the shares, in the trust fund. And Victoria could not accept it. Back at Martha's, Grace sat by the window holding an envelope. Her name was on the front. Robert's handwriting. The ink slightly smudged. It had been included with the will. She hadn't opened it. Not yet. Because reading it would make all of this real. She clutched it to her chest and whispered, "Why me, Robert? Why now?" The answer would come, but not tonight. "Tonight," she cried. And in that crying was 20 years of silent service. Finally breaking free. The morning after Grace left the Whitaker mansion, the estate sat unnervingly still. The staff moved quietly. Curtains remained drawn, and in the upstairs study, Robert's sanctuary, Victoria stood alone, staring out at the garden as if trying to summon him back with sheer willpower. But no amount of grief could distract her from what she saw as betrayal. She poured herself a second glass of wine, far too early, and stared at the binder left on Robert's desk. The will, highlighted pages, post-it notes, legal tabs. She couldn't sleep, not because her husband had passed, but because of what he left behind. Her husband had entrusted the nanny with everything. And it wasn't just about money. It was power, control, legacy. And it was all handed to someone who didn't share his blood. David stared at the ceiling in his penthouse. He hadn't slept either. The headlines were everywhere now. Nanny becomes power broker in billion-dollar estate. Whitaker family in shock after will leaves executor role to employee. Grief or greed? Questions emerge in sudden transfer of power. He tossed his phone onto the couch, rage bubbling under the surface. He had always known his father was difficult, withholding, judgmental. But David had spent the last decade proving himself. He climbed through the company ranks, closing deals, managing acquisitions, hiring the best minds, restructuring operations. And yet, he was bypassed. His own father had chosen the woman who used to read him bedtime stories over the son who carried his last name. He couldn't let it go, not just because of the money, but because of what it said about him, to the world, to himself. Elizabeth was different. She hadn't slept much either, but not because of rage. Her thoughts were spinning in a different direction. She sat at her small breakfast table, the untouched tea growing cold beside her. Her apartment was modest compared to her family's wealth, warmly decorated with art, plants, and books. She had chosen distance from the family empire long ago, but this turned everything upside down. She reread the copy of the will Thomas had sent her. 25% stake, Cape Cod estate, endowed gallery. She didn't care about any of that. She cared about the name that now appeared on nearly every page. Grace, the woman who held her when she lost her mother, the woman who taught her to sew, who never missed a single school play, who packed her lunches with tiny folded notes inside, and now, she was the face of a war. Elizabeth's heart hurt for her, for Grace, thrust into a role that no one wanted her to have, except for the man who mattered most, her father. Elizabeth picked up her phone and texted Grace, "Are you okay? I believe you. Let me know if you need anything." It was the only message of kindness Grace had received in 2 days. Grace sat at the breakfast table, her tea untouched too. Martha had made fresh bread, scrambled eggs, and cut strawberries. But Grace couldn't eat. "Everything's changed, Mar," she whispered. Martha nodded. "You didn't ask for this. I didn't even know about it." "I believe you," Martha said firmly. "But they won't." Grace clutched her mug tighter. "Victoria fired me. David won't speak to me. And Emily, she doesn't even know what to think. She's just a child. What do I do?" "You breathe," Martha said. "Then you protect yourself. And then you decide, do you run from this or stand in it?" Grace swallowed hard. Martha leaned forward. "You always said your job was to protect those kids. That hasn't changed. It's just louder now." By that afternoon, the first lawsuit was drafted. Victoria and David filed jointly, motion to contest the validity of the last will and testament of Robert Whitaker. The claims were aggressive: undue influence, mental incapacity, questionable changes to estate planning late in life. Their attorneys called a press conference within 48 hours. "We believe the late Mr. Whitaker was manipulated by someone in a position of trust," the spokesperson said, cameras flashing. "This is not about bitterness, it's about fairness." Grace watched from Martha's couch, hands shaking. "This is about justice," the lawyer concluded, "and protecting the legacy of a great man." Martha clicked the TV off. Grace whispered, "They think I stole him." "They're afraid," Martha said, "and grief makes fear look like fury." Whitaker Industries plummeted by 3.7% the following week. Investors were uneasy. The press hounded board members. The story became clickbait gold. From nanny to CEO power player? Family betrayal or final act of love? Who really controls the Whitaker empire now? Grace received 3 interview requests from major news outlets. She declined them all. She wasn't interested in fame. She wanted peace. But peace wasn't an option anymore. 3 days after the lawsuit was filed, Elizabeth showed up at Martha's door. She brought pastries, a bouquet of tulips, and her presents. Grace opened the door slowly, almost tearful at the sight of her. "I didn't know if I should come," Elizabeth said, "but I had to see you." They sat together in silence at first, the air thick with shared grief and unspoken memories. Then Elizabeth broke it. "Did you know?" "No," Grace said immediately, shaking her head. "He never told me. I didn't even know there was a new will." "I believe you," Elizabeth said. Grace finally broke down. "I feel like I've ruined everything." Elizabeth took her hand. "No, Grace. He did this. Dad did this. And maybe it wasn't fair to you either. But I think Maybe he trusted you because he knew you'd do right by all of us. Grace wiped her eyes. But they hate me. They don't hate you, Elizabeth said softly. They hate what this made them feel. Grace nodded slowly. And for the first time in days, she felt seen. David stormed into Whitaker Industries the next morning, demanding to be named CEO immediately. The board, hesitant, wary, and politically divided, granted him the title acting CEO but made no promises beyond probate resolution. One executive whispered after the meeting, "It's a temporary title until the real decisions can be made." David heard it, and it enraged him further. To him, the nanny was still standing in the way of his birthright. He wasn't going to let that happen. He launched an internal audit, and he ordered the company's attorneys to prepare to challenge any voting rights held by the Whitaker Trust, of which Grace was now trustee. Victoria, in a sharp pantsuit, met with a separate legal team. Her mission? Sever Grace from every point of influence. She wanted the trust restructured. She wanted the executor role revoked. She wanted Grace out of every conversation. Her attorney, a ruthless Ivy League graduate with perfect hair and colder ethics, leaned in. "We need evidence of manipulation, a suggestion, a rumor, anything that hints at inappropriate influence." Victoria's voice was icy. "Find it, or fabricate it." Meanwhile, Emily sat on her bed in the mansion, staring at her tablet. She wasn't allowed to call Grace. Victoria had forbidden it. "She's not part of our lives anymore," her mother had said. But Emily didn't understand. She missed Grace. She missed bedtime stories, warm oatmeal in the mornings, the way Grace would braid her hair before school and call her Sunflower. Emily didn't care about trust funds or legal terms. She cared about love. And that love was suddenly missing. That night, Grace finally opened Robert's letter. It read, "Grace, if you are reading this, I am gone. And I can only imagine the storm you've been dragged into. I know I've placed an unfair burden on you, and for that, I'm sorry. But I did it because you are the only one who has never asked for anything, yet given everything. I made choices I knew would hurt people, but I feared that without someone like you overseeing things, my family would fall apart. You were the glue, always, and I hoped that, even in this strange way, I could keep that glue strong enough to hold them together. Do not let guilt guide you. Let love guide you, and let your judgment speak louder than their anger. You are not just the nanny, Grace. You are their anchor. With respect and gratitude, Robert." Grace read it 3 times. Then she wept. Grace stood at the window of Martha's small cottage, her cup of tea growing cold in her hands. She watched a young boy across the street toss a football into the air, catch it, miss it, laugh. Life was still moving, but her own felt suspended, caught between memory and responsibility. The letter from Robert had not brought peace. It brought weight, heavy, irreversible weight. She now held the family in her hands, their money, their estate, their future. She had spent 23 years invisible. Now the world had turned her into the most visible woman in the Whitaker legacy. And the ones she had loved the most, David, Victoria, Emily, were tearing her apart in court. That morning, a courier arrived with a summons. The lawsuit was now formal. It named her personally. The language was brutal. Acted beyond the scope of professional duty. Leveraged. Emotional dependence for undue influence. Benefited financially at the expense of rightful heirs. Grace stared at the paper as if it were written in a foreign tongue. Martha took it from her, read it silently, then folded it. "They're not just challenging the will," Martha said quietly. "They're challenging your character." Grace sat down slowly. "Then maybe I shouldn't fight." "What will that solve?" Martha asked. "It'll give them what they want, and destroy the man's wishes who trusted you with everything." Grace looked up. "They think I seduced him, manipulated him. And did you?" Martha's voice was firm, unyielding. "No," Grace said softly. "I never even crossed the line. I always called him Mr. Whitaker, even after all these years." "Then don't let shame write your story." Elizabeth called a meeting at a quiet cafe downtown. She invited David, Grace, and a neutral third-party advisor to sit with them. Her goal? Mediation. Avoid court. David arrived late, arms crossed, face unreadable. Grace arrived early, visibly nervous. The meeting started with civility, but it didn't last. David's voice cut through the room like a blade. You could end all of this, Grace. Just walk away. Resign as trustee. Hand over the reins. No one would blame you. I would, Elizabeth interjected. David ignored her. You were our nanny. You were loved, respected. But this is greed cloaked in loyalty. Grace's jaw tightened. You think I asked for this? You didn't say no. I didn't know. I didn't even want it. I still don't know if I'm strong enough. Then don't be, he snapped. Let the real family handle this. Elizabeth stood. David, stop. But he wasn't done. My father died thinking none of us were capable. And you're proving him right, he said, glaring at Grace. She flinched. The words landed like punches, but she didn't cry. Not this time. She looked at him and whispered, he trusted me. I didn't betray him. You're just angry he didn't choose you. David froze. Because it was true, and it hurt. A week later they all met again, this time at the courthouse. Judge Catherine Miller presided. Stern. Professional. Not swayed by emotion. Victoria sat beside David, her outfit pristine, her posture stiff. Grace sat with her attorney, trying to disappear into her own coat. Elizabeth sat alone, arms folded, tired. Is there any intent to settle this outside of litigation? Judge Miller asked, scanning the room. David's lawyer stood. Your Honor, we believe there are grounds for undue influence. Grace's attorney stood too. And we intend to show this will was executed properly, with witnesses, medical sign-off, and clear intent. The judge sighed. Then prepare for discovery. I advise all parties to consider the toll this will take, financially, emotionally, publicly. Family goes to war, Whitaker estate battle escalates, Nanny turns power. Player as legal showdown looms. What did the CEO know before he died? Inside the trust, drama reporters began camping outside Martha's cottage. Grace refused to speak. But she was beginning to unravel. Each day felt like a trial. Each headline a judgment. Each look from Victoria or David a betrayal. Even Emily was no longer allowed to speak to her. And that hurt most of all. It happened in the middle of the night. Martha found her curled on the kitchen floor, clutching Robert's letter and sobbing. I didn't ask for this, she whispered. I gave them my life. Martha knelt beside her. And he gave you his trust. But they all hate me. They hate what they think you mean. Not you. I was their nanny. You were their mother, Martha corrected gently. Grace looked up, eyes red. Then why do I feel like the villain? 3 years before Robert's death, he had a mild stroke. Grace was the only one who noticed the slur in his speech. The slight limp. The way he forgot small things. She convinced him to see a doctor. She sat with him through tests. She cooked meals, hid medications in soup when he refused them, and protected his dignity from the children. He had said, if I die, they'll fight. Grace had nodded. He added, promise me you'll try to keep them together. She had said yes, but she hadn't imagined this. The family lawyer visited Grace with a file. He sat at Martha's table, calm as ever. Robert was not impulsive, he said. He documented everything. I had him undergo psychiatric evaluation when he made the will changes. Grace raised her eyes. You did? Yes. For exactly this reason. The court will have a hard time proving incapacity. What about the manipulation? Thomas smiled kindly. You don't have it in you, Grace. Anyone who's watched you for 10 minutes can see that. But that won't stop them from trying, she murmured. No, Thomas agreed. But it will help you win. Grace sat back. What if I don't want to win? Thomas leaned in. Then what did he die for? Emily, hidden away from the storm by her mother's orders, missed Grace deeply. She snuck a tablet under her bed covers and re-watched old birthday videos. There was Grace, holding the cake. Grace, clapping. Grace, wiping frosting from her chin. She texted Elizabeth, why can't I see Grace? Elizabeth replied, I'm trying, sweetheart, I promise. Emily stared out the window that night and made a decision. The next morning, Martha opened her front door to find Emily, coat askew, cheeks red, backpack on. I came to see Grace. Grace ran out and hugged her, tears in her eyes. How did you? I remembered the back gate code, Emily said, proud and breathless. You walked here? I took a cab. Alone? Emily nodded. Grace knelt. Your mom must be worried sick. She didn't even notice, Emily said bitterly. She's too busy yelling about court. Grace pulled her into the house. For the next hour, they sat by the fireplace, talked, read old stories, laughed, until the doorbell rang. It was Victoria. Face pale, eyes red, rage and relief wrapped into one. Emily ran to her. Victoria hugged her tightly, trembling. Then she looked up at Grace. I could call the police. You won't, Grace said softly. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Don't test me. Grace didn't flinch. She missed me. I'm her mother, and I'm not trying to replace you. Victoria stood frozen. Then Grace added gently, but you and I both know she needs both of us. Victoria stared at her for a long moment, then turned and left, Emily in hand. But she didn't slam the door. The wind picked up that morning over the Whitaker estate, rustling the gold leaves into little storms that scattered across the marble steps. Autumn always looked beautiful from the outside, but inside that house, it was winter. Cold, bitter, and silent. Victoria sat in Robert's old study, alone. Emily was at school. David had stopped visiting. And the lawyers, well, they came only when summoned. She had asked for quiet, but silence didn't soothe her. It mocked her. The will still sat on Robert's desk like a scar she couldn't cover. She stared at the name again. Grace Miller. It haunted her. Everywhere she looked, Grace's presence lingered. In the bookshelves, she helped organize. In the family photos where she was in the background, holding Emily. In the scent of lavender, Grace's signature fabric softener still woven into the curtains. Victoria picked up a framed photo of her wedding day. She and Robert smiling, Elizabeth stiff, David glaring. Grace? She wasn't in it. But she might as well have been. Victoria remembered how Robert had begun changing in his final year. Quieter, more distracted, kind but absent. She had assumed it was age, or grief over the business slowing down. But now she wondered, had he been planning this, rewriting the future behind her back? Had he trusted Grace more than he'd trusted his own wife? She remembered a strange night. Robert came home late, pulled her into the study, and asked out of nowhere, "Do you think the kids would be okay if I wasn't around?" She had dismissed the question with a laugh. He hadn't laughed back. Instead, he'd said, "Grace has a way of knowing what they need, sometimes better than I do." That had stung then, and it burned now. Thomas Abernathy had assembled everything: estate summaries, trustee responsibilities, asset breakdowns, shareholder breakdowns for Whitaker Industries. Grace sat across from him, overwhelmed. "You now oversee the distribution of roughly $180 million, he said softly. Grace swallowed. "How do I even begin?" Thomas smiled kindly. "You begin with integrity, which you have, in spades, but they hate me. They hate what this says about them." Grace looked up. "Do you think I should step down?" Thomas leaned forward. "Do you want to?" "No, but I want peace." "Then use your power to offer it." Back at her gallery office, Elizabeth drafted a message. Subject: Proposal for Mediation Framework to David Whitaker, Victoria, Whitaker, Grace Miller, Thomas Abernathy CC, Legal Counsel, BCC'd. Dear all, I am writing as both a beneficiary and a daughter. This battle is destroying us. I propose the following. Grace remains trustee, but with a family oversight committee consisting of 3 members. Grace, 1 legal appointee, and 1 family representative, David or myself. Victoria receives full autonomy over the Manhattan residence and additional quarterly discretionary funding above her allowance. David is confirmed as permanent CEO of Whitaker Industries, with shareholder voting. Rights aligned through Grace, unless in direct conflict with company stability. In exchange, all parties agree to withdraw contestation of the will and cease all legal actions. This isn't about victory, it's about healing. She hit send and prayed. Later that night, while sorting Robert's old documents, Victoria found something tucked into a leather journal. It wasn't labeled, just folded inside. She opened it. It was a note, scribbled, not meant for anyone's eyes. Marilyn, I've done my best, but I'm failing at giving them what you did. Grace is the one who holds this family together. I only wish I could give her more than just trust. Victoria's hands shook. He hadn't loved Grace. That wasn't the betrayal. It was something deeper. He had admired her. Victoria called Elizabeth. I got your email. Elizabeth was surprised. And? It's reasonable. Are you saying you'll agree? I'm saying I'm tired, Liz, Victoria said quietly. And Emily deserves better than this circus. There was a pause. Do you still hate her? Elizabeth asked gently. I hate what she reminds me of. And what's that? That I was never first in his heart. Elizabeth didn't know what to say to that. But Victoria did. I'll sign the proposal. With one condition. What? She never enters this house again. But that condition didn't sit well with Emily. When she overheard her mother on the phone later that night, she burst into tears. I want Grace to be at my birthday. She can't, Victoria said gently. She always is. I'm your mother, Emily. She was always there when you weren't. The words came out like a slap. Victoria stood still. Emily ran to her room. And Victoria sat on the floor, crying alone in the kitchen. Meanwhile, David reviewed the mediation proposal over a glass of bourbon. He paced his office, picked up the phone, dialed, hung up, dialed again. Thomas, he said finally, this settlement. Yes? It's smart. I think so. David hesitated. Will it make me look weak? Thomas chuckled. Or will it make you look like a man who finally sees what his father was trying to do? David was quiet for a long time, then said, Draw it up. I'll sign. When Elizabeth showed Grace the finalized settlement papers, Grace cried. You mean, it's over? It could be, if you want it. Grace read every clause. Executor remains. Trustee remains. Oversight committee formed. Family peace preserved. Then she flipped to the very last page, where her own name was listed beneath. Accepted by Grace Miller, in her capacity as trustee and executor of the Whitaker family estate. She picked up the pen and signed. Later that night, Grace sat outside Martha's porch, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea. Martha joined her. You okay? I think I will be. You did the right thing. I hope so, Grace whispered. I still love them, March. Even after all this, I know. Even Victoria. Martha smiled. You always were the stubborn, forgiving one. They laughed softly. Then Grace added, I didn't win, did I? No. But you didn't lose either. The ink was barely dry on the settlement agreement when the next challenge began, learning how to live with it. The lawsuit was dropped. The court hearings were canceled. The tabloids moved on. But inside the hearts of everyone involved, the damage still echoed. A signature may have ended the war on paper, but healing? That would take time. And Grace. David's first board meeting as permanent CEO was quiet, businesslike, almost anticlimactic. The board had expected him to be triumphant. Instead, he was subdued. He wore his father's old cufflinks. His tie was slightly crooked, just like Robert's had always been. And he walked into that meeting carrying the invisible weight of an empire not built by him, but handed to him by a man who didn't trust him enough to give it freely. He presented the quarterly strategy. Clear, decisive, well-planned. The board voted in favor. Afterward, Gerald Hansen, the longtime CFO and Robert's friend, stopped him in the hallway. You did good in there. David nodded. Thanks. Gerald looked at him for a long moment. He loved you, you know. David looked away. He had a funny way of showing it. He believed in tough love, Gerald said. But love, nonetheless. David didn't reply. But he held on to those words. The Stone Harbor cottage sat by a rocky cove in New Jersey, modest, serene, untouched by scandal. It was the one part of the will Grace hadn't contested, negotiated, or shared. Robert had left it to her personally. She arrived there with 2 suitcases, a photo of her late mother, and a single box of books collected over 20 years of service. Martha helped her unpack. The cottage smelled like salt and pine. The sea breeze came through the windows like an old friend. This is yours now, Martha said, handing her the keys. Grace stared out the back porch at the crashing waves. It feels too quiet. You'll get used to peace. I've never had peace, Grace whispered. 3 days later, a handwritten letter arrived at the cottage. Dear Grace, I miss you. The gallery is steady again, and I've found peace in small things. Planting tomatoes, on my windowsill, listening to old jazz, eating toast without rushing. David's different now. Quieter, more thoughtful. I think he carries more guilt than he knows how to name. Victoria hasn't spoken much, but she didn't refuse my invitation for brunch last Sunday. That's something. Emily asks about you every day. I think you saved us. And I hope you find a way to save yourself too. With love, Liz. Grace cried when she read it. Not from sadness, but from the realization that she was allowed to be missed, allowed to matter. Back at the mansion, Victoria had not returned to her foundation board meetings. She had avoided charity galas, politely declined interviews, and stopped answering most emails. Instead, she read journals, letters, old correspondence from Robert's early business years. She found an old anniversary card from him, simple but tender. To my V, thank you for bringing laughter back into this house. R. She traced the R with her finger. Was it love? Was it trust? Was it habit? She no longer knew. All she knew was that for the first time in her adult life, she wasn't someone's wife. She was just Victoria. And that terrified her. When Elizabeth came by one afternoon, she found her stepmother sitting by the fireplace, wine glass untouched, fireplace unlit. Do you want to go for a walk? I haven't walked the estate since the will was read, Victoria said softly. Then let's walk, Elizabeth replied. They strolled through the garden Robert had planted years ago. Peonies, hydrangeas, late-season roses that still clung to the branches in protest of the cold. They didn't speak for a while. Then Victoria said, I hated her for a long time. I know. I thought she was trying to take my place. But really, she had one of her own. Elizabeth nodded. Victoria added, she raised my daughter better than I did. Elizabeth looked at her. You did the best you could. You were grieving too. I was busy being Mrs. Whittaker, Victoria said. I never figured out how to be Emily's mother and Robert's wife at the same time. You still have time. Victoria looked toward the hills. Do the first? Elizabeth placed a hand on her arm. You do. A week later, David asked to meet Grace. She agreed, reluctantly. They met at a park halfway between her cottage and the city. It was cold. Leaves crunched beneath their shoes. David was nervous. He didn't shake her hand. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, staring at the lake. I've been thinking about what you said, about trust, about how he chose you. Grace waited. David turned. I was cruel. I let my pride talk. I'm sorry. Grace's breath caught. She hadn't expected it. I was raised to believe I had to fight for everything, he said. So when he didn't give it to me, when he gave it to you, I thought it meant I failed. Grace stepped closer. You didn't fail, David. He laughed once. But I didn't pass, either. Grace offered a smile. He trusted you with the company. That matters. David nodded slowly. Then quieter. Did he ever say anything about me toward the end? Grace paused. Then said, he said you were brilliant, but stubborn. That you reminded him of himself. David blinked rapidly. Thank you, he whispered. Grace placed a hand on his shoulder. And for the first time since Robert's death, they stood side by side without tension. That night, Grace's phone rang. It was Emily. Hi, sweet pea. I miss you, the little voice said. I miss you too. Mom says I can't come visit yet. I understand. She's just being careful. Will you come to my recital next month? Please. Grace's heart clenched. If your mom says yes, I'll be there. Emily's smile traveled through the phone. I'm singing the song you used to hum while braiding my hair. Grace covered her mouth. I love you, Grace. I love you more, Sunflower. Weeks later, a small article appeared in the New York Ledger business section. Trustee Grace Miller establishes Whittaker Educational Endowment. In an unexpected philanthropic move, Grace Miller, executor of the Whittaker estate, has established an education fund for underprivileged youth, focusing on children of domestic workers across the state. When asked why, Ms. Miller replied, "Because someone believed in me when I had nothing. I'd like to do the same for others." Spring arrived early the next year, and with it came an unexpected invitation. Victoria was hosting a private garden luncheon at the Whitaker estate for family, close friends, and donors to the newly revived Whitaker Foundation. Grace's name was on the guest list. She hesitated, but she went. She wore a soft blue dress. Simple, elegant, the same style she'd worn to Emily's kindergarten graduation years ago. When she arrived, the guests parted in surprise. Victoria greeted her at the steps. "Thank you for coming," she said formally. "Thank you for inviting me." They didn't hug, but they didn't need to. Emily ran to Grace and pulled her inside. The world didn't stop spinning, but for a brief moment it spun in peace. The soft piano notes echoed through the grand auditorium. It was Emily's first major recital at St. Clair's Preparatory. Grace sat alone in the back row. The lights dimmed, velvet curtains parted. A dozen children took their places on stage. Emily was third from the left. Grace's breath caught. The little girl wore a simple ivory dress, hair neatly pinned, eyes searching the crowd. And then, they found her. Grace raised a hand slowly. Emily's face lit up. When it was Emily's turn, the entire room hushed. The spotlight followed her small frame to the microphone. She glanced down at her music sheet, then looked up, and said, "This song is for someone who sang to me when I was scared, someone who brushed my hair and told me I could do anything." Silence. "She's not my mom, but she's still my heart." Then she sang, pure, unshaken, a voice too big for her size. Grace wept in silence. So did Victoria. Unbeknownst to Grace, she was seated on the opposite side of the auditorium. Victoria hadn't told anyone she'd come. After the recital, parents crowded the lobby. Flowers, pictures, laughter. Grace stayed back. She didn't want to cause a scene. She started toward the side exit, but Emily saw her and ran. "Grace, sweetheart." They hugged tightly. Victoria stepped out a moment later. For a moment, Mother and Nanny stood side by side, neither knowing how to exist in the same space without competing for the child they both loved. Victoria broke the silence. She sang beautifully. Grace nodded. "She has your fire." Victoria looked down. "She has your heart." Another pause. "I'm sorry," Victoria whispered. Grace blinked. "You don't have to." "I do." Grace took a breath. "Then, I'm sorry too." They stood there, not friends, not enemies, just women learning to forgive. Grace returned to Stone Harbor, but she was no longer hiding. She opened the windows wide. She joined the community's book club. She taught writing classes at the local library. She wrote a short memoir, anonymously published, titled The Third Seat at the Table. It told the story of a woman who served a family, raised a child, and finally found herself outside the shadow of wealth and legacy. The book began to quietly circulate. It didn't become a bestseller, but it healed something in her. In the city, Elizabeth's Gallery hosted a spring exhibit. The theme, Unspoken Women. One of the pieces featured was a minimalist sculpture titled Nanny, a figure made of bronze and wire, arms always reaching, never receiving. When asked about it by the press, Elizabeth simply said, "It's about the ones who raise us without ever asking for the credit." The next week, she mailed a photo of the sculpture to Grace. No note, just the image, and a post-it with one word, "You." Under Grace's supervision, the Whitaker Foundation launched a mentorship program for children of single parents working in domestic service or care labor. Grace visited community centers. She attended luncheons. She declined interviews, and yet, quietly, her name began to travel in spaces where it never had before. Not as the nanny, not as the trustee, just Grace Miller, leader, advocate, human being. Whitaker Industries, under David's leadership, saw modest but meaningful growth. He restructured the old hotel division and invested in green real estate. He began an internship program for underrepresented students interested in real estate law. He didn't say it out loud, but everyone knew. Grace's influence lingered even there. One afternoon during a shareholder Q&A, a young woman asked, "What would your father think of the changes you've made?" David thought for a long time, then said, "I think he'd say, 'It's about time.'" Victoria traveled, for the first time alone. She went to Italy, toured vineyards. She sent postcards to Emily and to Elizabeth. She even mailed one to Grace's foundation office. On the back, it read, "I saw a little girl in Florence holding her nanny's hand. Thought of you. Hope you're well. V." It wasn't friendship, but it was peace. Martha finally sold her diner. She used the money to open a small flower shop. She called it Miller's Blooms. Grace visited on weekends. They laughed, argued over floral arrangements, and spent time like old friends finally free of old burdens. One Saturday, Grace noticed a photo hanging by the register. It was of Robert and Emily and Grace, sitting in the backyard on a summer day, unposed, natural, joyful. Martha saw her staring. "He gave me that picture before he died," she said. "Said it was the only time he felt the family was whole." Grace's throat tightened. He wasn't wrong. On a cool morning in May, Grace sat by the sea and wrote a letter she would never send. "Dear Grace, you were never just the nanny. You were the bridge, the backbone, the whisper between storms. You taught love without conditions. And now, you're free, not because they gave you permission, but because you finally gave it to yourself. G." She folded the letter, placed it in a jar, and buried it under the oak tree beside the cottage. A reminder that some stories don't need to be published to matter. They just need to be lived. It came in a white envelope with a silver seal, no return address. Just her name, Miss Grace Miller, written in elegant handwriting. Inside, a single ivory card. "The Women Who Build Foundation cordially invites you to accept our 2026 Keynote Award for Unseen Influence in Family Legacy. Location, the New York Public Library. Date, November 12th. Dress code, formal please reply required." Grace stared at it. She wasn't used to being recognized. Not like this. She didn't feel like a woman who built anything. Not in the way they meant. She had loved. She had endured. She had fought. But she hadn't built, had she? "Of course you're going," Martha said over tea, waving the card like it was a golden ticket. "I don't even know who nominated me. Who cares? You earned it. They'll be expecting a polished philanthropist, a power suit, big heels. They'll be getting the real thing. That's better." Grace hesitated. "I was just a nanny." Martha's voice softened. "You were never just anything." Grace looked away, but her eyes shimmered. 2 days later, she received an email from David. Subject, "Heard the news, Grace. I saw the keynote announcement. Congratulations. I know you hate public speeches, but if anyone deserves a room listening, it's you. Emily is proud. So am I, David." She smiled and hit reply. "Thank you. I might need a suit or armor. Grace." Then, unexpectedly, a package arrived. From V. Whitaker. Inside, a soft charcoal gray gown, modest, sophisticated, wrapped in tissue paper, and a note. "You don't need armor. You're already the strongest woman I know. Wear this instead." 5th. Grace ran her hand over the fabric. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, accepted, and for the first time in a long time, felt beautiful. November 12th. The marble steps of the New York Public Library gleamed under golden floodlights. Inside, chandeliers glittered. Journalists whispered. Guests arrived in pearls, tuxedos, flowing gowns. And then, Grace walked in. Alone, head held high, wearing Victoria's gown, hair pulled back into a simple bun. No jewelry, no entourage, just presence. She took her seat quietly, unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. Elizabeth spotted her from across the hall and smiled warmly. David was seated 2 rows ahead, nodding with quiet pride. And at the back, hidden from cameras, stood Victoria, arms crossed, watching. When the host stepped onto the stage, she cleared her throat and said, "Tonight's honoree is not a CEO, not a mogul, not a politician. She never held a board seat, never ran a campaign, but she built a family when it was crumbling. She became a mother when one was grieving. And she redefined what legacy looks like, not through wealth or name, but through unwavering presence. Ladies and gentlemen, Please welcome Grace Miller. The applause was thunderous. Grace's legs trembled, but she walked every step of victory. She stood at the podium, blinked once, spoke. I was once told that the world doesn't reward the quiet ones, that the invisible people, the ones who pack lunches, answer midnight cries, stitch torn dresses and torn hearts, are meant to remain in the background. I believed that for a long time, until a man I worked for trusted me with his entire legacy. And then, until the family he left behind slowly learned to trust me too. I'm not here because I was loud. I'm here because I stayed. Pause. To all the unseen women, keep standing. Your story matters, even when no one writes it down. Silence. Then, a standing ovation. Even Victoria. Backstage, Grace sat alone for a few minutes, catching her breath. Elizabeth entered. That was stunning. Grace shook her head. It was terrifying, but true. They hugged. Then David stepped in. You made him proud tonight. Grace looked at him. I didn't do it for him. David nodded. I know. That's why it worked. Victoria appeared behind him. No words. Just a simple, elegant bouquet in her hands. She offered it to Grace. Grace took it, and they stood silently. Two women who had once fought for the same title and realized finally they were both so much more. The Whitaker Foundation opened a new campus in Newark, the Grace Miller Learning Center. Grace didn't attend the ribbon cutting. She was in Guatemala that week, visiting a small school supported by the foundation. Martha sent her a photo. The center's logo featured 3 figures, 1 adult, 2 children, holding hands. In her cottage by the sea, Grace now kept a shelf of photographs. Not posed ones, not corporate, real ones. Emily, covered in paint, grinning. David, holding a shovel at a volunteer build. Elizabeth, laughing in a hammock. Victoria, sitting in a circle with children reading aloud. And in the center, 1 photo of Robert, 1 of Grace, side by side. A reminder that sometimes the story isn't about who built the empire, but who held it together. 6 months after the awards ceremony, Grace received a sealed envelope, this time hand-delivered by a legal courier. Inside, a formal offer. Position, interim CEO of the Whitaker Foundation. Term, 1 year, with option to renew. Board approval, unanimous. Grace stared at it for hours. She wasn't a CEO. She didn't wear tailored pantsuits or carry portfolios. She wore sneakers and cardigans. She ran programs, not companies. But then she thought about Robert, about how he had once said, legacy isn't about buildings. It's about people, and about how David had told her, he trusted you with more than I realized. She picked up her pen. Signed. Grace walked into the foundation office on a Monday morning, wearing flat shoes, a calm smile, and no makeup. Staff stared at her, expecting someone different, but by noon, the energy had changed. She met with program leads, listened more than she spoke. She declined the corner office, choosing instead a shared space closer to the team. She asked for plain coffee, not a curated espresso bar. And by Friday, no one questioned her authority, not because she demanded it, but because she embodied it. Emily turned 9 that spring. The birthday party was held at the foundation's youth center. It was a humble affair, pizza, face paint, a magic show, but it was full of heart. Grace arrived with balloons. Victoria brought homemade cupcakes. Elizabeth gifted Emily a paint set. David handed her a wrapped box. Inside was a gold locket with a tiny photo, Robert on one side, Grace on the other. Emily gasped. Now I have both my hearts. She hugged Grace tightly and whispered, I'm glad you never left. Grace kissed the top of her head. I never will. One evening, Grace was invited back to the Whitaker mansion, not as staff but as guest. The home felt different, less museum, more memory. Victoria had removed many of Robert's formal portraits and replaced them with art by Emily and photos from recent family moments. The dining room was smaller now, the conversation warmer. David poured Grace a glass of wine. Victoria asked her about school initiatives. Elizabeth teased her about becoming Grace too. Emily brought her a bracelet made from seashells and yarn. And for the first time in decades, Grace felt like she was sitting at the table where she truly belonged. Martha's health began to decline that summer. One Sunday morning, Grace sat by her bedside, holding her hand. Martha smiled weakly. "Don't cry." "I'm not," Grace lied, blinking fast. "You made something out of nothing," Martha whispered. "That's what women like us were born to do." Grace wept quietly, kissing her forehead. A week later, Martha passed peacefully. Her flower shop closed for a day of remembrance. Grace scattered her ashes at the cove they used to walk by, under a weeping willow tree. A plaque now reads, "Martha Jones. She bloomed where she was planted." A journalist from The Atlantic reached out later that fall, asking for Grace's first and only sit-down interview. She almost declined, but she thought of all the women who never got the chance to speak. So she said yes. The final question was simple. Do you consider yourself a mother, a CEO, a philanthropist, or something else? Grace thought, then said, "I consider myself someone who showed up again and again, even when no one expected me to." Titles are given, but identity is chosen. I choose to be whole. And if that scares people, so be it. She was just the nanny, until love gave her a family, until grief gave her courage, until a will gave her power. But what truly changed everything was that she finally believed in her own worth. And once she did, the world followed. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe to Mr. Asher Stories, where truth lives in the quietest moments, and healing comes one tale at a time. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Someone else may need to hear your wisdom today. And remember, never underestimate the power of the unseen.